Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Welcome, everyone. Natural climate solutions are ways of storing carbon and avoiding greenhouse gas emissions through conservation, restoration, and improved management of landscapes and wetlands. And today we will examine the potential of natural climate solutions to help meet emissions reduction targets by sequestering carbon in roots and soils and reduce emissions from the land sector by protecting natural resources and natural spaces. We will also discuss the co-benefits of nature-based climate strategies to create resilient ecosystems and communities from the increasingly severe impacts of climate change. And I'd like to welcome everyone. We've all been quite interested in getting to this topic. So I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The climate crisis is a complex problem, and there is no single easy way to solve it. We have to explore every opportunity we have to keep carbon pollution out of the air and reduce climate risks and the rising costs to people and their communities. Over the past few months, this community has gathered information through hearings and site visits so that we can build common sense solutions to the climate crisis. We've examined the transportation sector, the electricity sector, the building sector, the industrial sector. We've discussed the importance of innovation. We've discussed investing in clean energy, rebuilding our infrastructure in a smart way, and creating good jobs in the process. Today, we're switching gears to discuss a powerful solution that is all around us, nature. The world's ecosystems can help us solve the climate crisis. Protecting and restoring our lands and our waterways and our natural spaces can provide a tremendous opportunity to capture and store significant amounts of carbon. As you'll hear from our terrific witnesses today, America's forests, grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural lands can store more carbon. Such carbon sequestration and sinks have the potential to store the equivalent of over 1/5 of the net emissions in the United States every year. And America's farmers are likely to develop solutions for the land that can be shared across the globe. Nature can help solve other climate change challenges as well. Take wetlands, for example. Whether it's mangroves in Florida or marshes in coastal Louisiana, wetlands are highly effective at storing carbon. They also make our coastal communities more resilient by buffering the impacts and reducing the costs of storm surge, of sea level rise, and flooding. Trees are another key natural climate solution. In fact, recent studies show that forests have the greatest potential to mitigate climate change. Trees can also help in the fight for climate justice. It turns out that urban forestry can reduce the effects of urban heat islands, protecting low-income communities from extreme heat. And investing in better forest management practices to reduce carbon pollution can also help protect communities from destructive wildfires. Oceans, bays, and lakes are helping us store and absorb more carbon, but they are stressed by acidification and warming. We must be mindful not to overload them and trigger ecosystem collapses that would harm everything dependent on them, including us. Nature offers us plenty of incredible resources to mitigate climate change, but only if we work to protect it. Every 30 seconds, our country loses a natural area the size of a football field to human development. When ecosystems are degraded or used for development, the carbon that they store is released into the atmosphere, contributing to a warming climate that will transform the way we live. On the other hand, when natural spaces and ecosystems are protected and restored, they have the capacity to do incredible things, like filter our air and our water, reduce heat in our cities, and help protect our communities from extreme weather events. So the choice is clear. Protecting nature provides immediate cost-effective opportunities to dramatically reduce emissions and create more resilient communities. Local communities are hungry for a deeper partnership and resources to adapt to the rising costs and impacts of the climate crisis. So I look forward to hearing from you on the best natural solutions to solve the climate crisis. Thank you all for being here today, and I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Graves, our ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you once again, two weeks in a row, for holding a really good topical hearing. I think this is an issue where we have much opportunity to work together to make a lot of progress. Madam Chair, you noted that this hearing is all about natural systems. How do we take advantage of our biogenic environment and help to enhance its ability to uptake greenhouse gases? And I think that it's often an overlooked part of the overall solution that we need to be maximizing. I think that when you look at the opportunities that we have in our natural systems to be able to uptake greenhouse gases, it's an extraordinary tool in our tool chest, and one that we probably ought to take a fresh look at 45Q and determine how to make tweaks or perhaps do a complementary component. It might be the one provision in the tax bill that my friend Mr. Huffman actually supported. But I think that it's an opportunity for us to once again work together. As Madam Chair, as you know, a few lives back, I worked on resilience and sustainability for South Louisiana. And back then, we developed one of the first clean development mechanisms in the world. We started before anyone else, and I think ours was really comprehensive. But first clean development mechanism in the world that actually quantified the uptake of greenhouse gases resulting from our coastal wetlands restoration projects and from preventing the loss of coastal wetlands. And as we've talked about at previous hearings, by restoring our coastal wetlands and our coastal systems, you complement what also we've talked about here, which is adaptation strategies and using our natural systems to help improve the resiliency of our communities. If as I think I've said at every hearing we've had, we lost 2,000 square miles of our coast in Louisiana. That's like the state of Rhode Island disappearing, which means when storms and hurricanes come, we no longer have that buffer. They don't evacuate Arkansas during hurricanes because Louisiana's the buffer. We've lost ours, which means we're more vulnerable to hurricanes. So you get a twofer. You get the ability to uptake greenhouse gases and sequester those, and you also improve the resilience of your communities. And I guess a third is the ecological productivity. So I do think that we have a big opportunity to work together on this topic as well as a few others that we've discussed in the past. I'm looking forward to hearing the testimony from the esteemed panel today. I had a chance to look over your submitted testimony and certainly appreciate all of you being here and looking forward to hearing your oral presentation. With that, I yield back.
Terrific. Without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements have 5 legislative days to do so. At this time, I want to welcome our terrific witnesses. We have an outstanding panel today. I'll go down the line, each of you, and I know Mr. Huffman wants to make a special introduction as well. First, we have Dr. Joe Fergione. Fergione, I think that's right. Okay, is the lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy's North America region. He is an expert in land use, conservation, and nature's benefits to people, including climate change mitigation. Our next witness is from Yurok, the Yurok Tribe, whose reservation is located in Mr. Huffman's district. And I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Huffman, to introduce him.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm really proud to introduce the Vice Chairman of the Yurok Tribe, Frankie Myers. The Yurok is the largest tribe in California, and it's also a tribe that is deeply and authentically connected to the beautiful lands of the Klamath River Basin that are its ancestral territory. Their stewardship of these lands, and especially the forests and the fisheries, has been noted and appreciated by folks all over California for sure, but their leadership has also been recognized by the United Nations Development Program, which gave the Yurok Tribe the Equator Prize, honoring innovative nature-based solutions for tackling climate change, environment, and policy challenges. I'm sure that we have a lot to learn from hearing from Vice Chairman Myers, and we welcome you to the committee, sir.
Welcome. Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Next is Dr. Jennifer Howard. She is the executive chairman, or excuse me, she is the Marine Climate Change Director at Conservation International. Her work focuses on protecting coastal and marine ecosystems to mitigate climate change and create resilient coasts and communities. Next, Mr. Alex Karsner is the executive chairman of Elemental Labs. He is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University and a member of the Hoover Institution's Energy Policy Task Force. He previously served as DOE's Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy under President George W. Bush. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Dr. Fergione, you are now recognized to give a 5-minute presentation of your testimony. Thank you.
Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak today. Climate change is no longer a distant threat. We are currently living with its impacts, and our actions now will determine if we can create a world where both people and nature thrive. The Nature Conservancy is committed to doing our part to tackle climate change by mobilizing action for a clean energy future, accelerating the deployment of natural solutions, and building resilience through natural defenses. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the critical role that nature can play in fighting climate change, what I refer to as natural climate solutions. If you remember one thing from my testimony, please remember that we can help fight climate change by planting trees, promoting soil health, and protecting our wetlands and coastal ecosystems. These natural climate solutions are affordable, they provide many co-benefits, and they are available now. You may wonder, what does nature have to do with fighting climate change? As you may recall from biology class, or at least from watching Star Trek, life on Earth is carbon-based. Plants, for example, are about half carbon. This means that we can help fight climate change by storing more carbon on the landscape in our trees and soils, and by reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from our natural and working lands. Last year, I led a study with 37 other experts from 22 institutions that assessed the potential for natural climate solutions to reduce emissions in the United States. Our study shows that natural climate solutions can play a significant role in fighting climate change with a maximum potential benefit equivalent to 1/5 of our nation's current net emissions. That's the same as if every car and light-duty truck in the country stopped emitting carbon. The largest opportunities have to do with planting trees, improved forest management, the avoided conversion of forests and grasslands, and building soil health in our agricultural lands. Significantly increasing our investments in natural climate solutions, in addition to a rapid transition to more zero-carbon energy and energy efficiency, is our best hope for dealing with the climate crisis. Natural climate solutions not only fight climate change, they provide many other benefits. They clean the air we breathe and the water we drink. They protect our lives and our property from storms and floods. They build soil health, restore forests for recreation and wildlife, and increase the productivity and resilience of our working lands. For example, investments in cover crops and other conservation practices on farm fields help improve the soil health and water quality, in addition to storing more carbon in the soil. Improved nutrient management can reduce the costs of fertilizers and save farmers money, in addition to reducing emissions of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. Urban reforestation increases people's quality of life and property values and reduces the cooling costs for their homes. And protecting and restoring coastal wetlands can help reduce storm surges and reduce flooding. Another promising finding of our study is just how affordable many natural climate solutions are. Specifically, there are hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide per year that can be kept out of the atmosphere at just $10 per ton of carbon dioxide or less, well under the price of other technologies that can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that is the price just for carbon. All of the other benefits of clean air and water, flood protection, and wildlife are thrown in for free. In short, they're a very good deal. And while we talk about this as a cost to reduce carbon, for the landowners and producers, this would be revenue. They would be getting paid for reducing pollution and helping provide a stable climate that benefits everyone. There are many ways to pay for natural climate solutions. Money could come from voluntary payments by companies that want to meet their emissions goals, by providing federal support directly to landowners and producers, such as through existing farm bill programs, or from new policies, like a price on carbon. Natural climate solutions are gaining traction because there are so many good reasons to invest in nature. From reducing costs for farmers and creating jobs for foresters, to improving air quality and protecting coastal communities from flooding, the benefits are numerous. For all these reasons, the time is right for us to make a significant investment in natural climate solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Myers, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Squeena Kitchway, Chairwoman Castor, ranking members, Grave, and committee members, thank you for the invitation to testify today about the role of forests in cutting pollution and building resiliency. Per our traditional protocol and policy, I'm going to open with a prayer before I get my statement. Woklat wana ye nat swagin kepik. Woklat wana ye got kukika no ma ke all. Chat squeeza may get taught qua ku all. Ku piscat, rewoy, rewa, ua gerchers. Chat squeeza may get taught qua ku netatmer, netatmer. Woklat, woklat, woklat. Now Frankie Myers. I'm the vice chairman of the Yurok Tribe, the largest federally recognized tribe in California with around 6,500 members. Our Aboriginal territory spanned about 1.5 million acres of oceans, rivers, redwood forests, and upland prairies. Our reservation now includes 1 mile on either side of the Klamath River, from the mouth of the river up 45 miles. I want to start off by dispelling a myth that nature is wild. Nature, in Yurok belief, is only natural when humans are a part of it. It's a tenet of Yurok belief that you have to be a part of the world around you to truly have a natural forest and ecosystem. Our current forest management policies recognize that by using our time-tested indigenous knowledge, we can develop a healthy, functioning forest ecosystem that will provide long-term benefits, certainty, and resiliency to the impact of climate change. Resource management planning must focus on long-term management, goals, and objectives, guided by a clear vision of the future of our forest, rather than focusing on short-term benefits of extractive management. Our forest ecosystem function and integrity need to be held to equal value with the economic benefits of forest. This approach will bring back balance to the forest, a balance that was lost due to intensive extractive forest practices. Bringing back balance starts with returning land to the traditional stewards. For us, thousands and thousands of acres were lost in the mid and late 1800s through federal Indian land policy. The original Yurok reservation was cut down to a mere 4,000 acres. For over a century, Yurok ancestral forest lands were used by non-Indians as commercial timberlands, turning our precious old-growth coastal redwood forest into a network of dirt roads, timber slash piles, and clear-cut hills. These monoculture forestry practices decimated wildlife habitat, suppressed the native ecology, and destroyed the abundant natural resources that were created over centuries of traditional land management practices. To implement the tribe's forest management policies, as well as heal from historical losses, the Yurok Tribe has been actively working to recover its homeland with a goal of restoring balance. In 2018, after 2 decades of working with the Yurok Tribe reacquired nearly 60,000 acres of our traditional forest lands adjacent to the reservation. Through the reacquisition of forest lands, the tribe is engaging in forestry practices gathered by traditional knowledge, backed by Western science, with the goal of restoring the forest lands to a dynamic ecosystem. One example is the tribe's carbon project. The Yurok was the first tribe to participate in selling California Air Resource Board issued carbon offsets credits in the state's cap and trade program. By 2020, we will manage multiple improved forest management projects in the cap and trade program, totaling over 47,500 acres on and adjacent to the Yurok Reservation. The program provides for a market mechanism for reducing carbon dioxide emissions from California's largest CO2 emitters. The program works by limiting or capping the amount of emissions large corporations or industries emit. The emission limit is then reduced over time so that total emissions will decrease to meet state targets. Carbon sequestration, like Yurok's, supply the carbon offsets for the regulated entities to meet their reduction limits. On the carbon offset seller side, carbon projects are developed on forest lands that may otherwise be used for extractive purposes. This effort, coupled with the Yurok Lands Act bill, pending in the House now, which would also add to the Yurok Reservation and our stewardship, would include carbon projects and allow the tribe to manage our natural resources in a way that builds and improves climate change resiliency and cuts pollution. We urge the Congress to support the Lands Acts and encourage this committee to support values, policies, and programs that hold equal forest ecosystem functions and integrity with the economic benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Howard, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee for inviting me today. It's a pleasure testifying today with Andy Karsner.
I'm not sure if your microphone is on or move it closer to you.
Is that better? Yeah. I think they said this one was low. Can I borrow Andy's? Do I get my time to start over? Yeah. Okay. All right, take two. Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee for inviting me today. It's a pleasure testifying today with Andy Karsner, who sits on Conservation International's Board of Directors, and with Vice Chairman Myers. Our organization is working closely with the Yurok Tribe on the California Tropical Forest Standard, and my colleague from TNC. TNC is a key partner with Conservation International on the subject of blue carbon. I'll start by saying that all people on Earth depend directly or indirectly on the ocean. From the food we eat, our global economy, and cultural values, the ocean touches every aspect of our lives and allows us to thrive on this planet. And now the oceans are demanding that we shift our thinking around climate change. It is not a problem restricted to the atmosphere. The atmosphere, land, and oceans all work together to regulate our planet, and changes to one will and have been impacting the others. Thus, climate change is ocean change. The IPCC Ocean and Cryosphere report, published last month, describes these changes in no uncertain terms. Today's ocean is warmer, rising, and more acidic. In my lifetime, extreme weather events will be common, with extreme flooding events occurring annually. In my 2-year-old son's lifetime, most of the low-lying regions around the world may face adaptation limits as they succumb to sea level rise. That is scary, but it's not all bad news. Nature's a powerful ally reducing emissions and protecting the coast through no-regret strategies where the planet and people both benefit. No-regret strategy number 1, conserve and restore coastal blue carbon ecosystems. The term blue carbon refers to the carbon sequestered and stored in coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrasses. Blue carbon ecosystems act as long-term carbon sinks, are contained within clear national jurisdictions, and can be integrated into national greenhouse gas accounting. They also provide food and livelihoods while harboring incredible biodiversity, making their protection one of the most effective but most underutilized nature-based strategies to combat climate change. However, improper and inadequate management of coastal ecosystems has led to their dramatic decline. We have lost 50% of blue carbon ecosystems in the last 50 years, resulting in 450 million tons of CO2 emissions annually. However, aggressive conservation and restoration efforts could result in climate mitigation benefits of 1.4 gigatons of CO2 removals each year by 2050. Roughly the annual emissions of all the cars in California, Texas, New York, and Louisiana combined. Louisiana too. No regret strategy number 2, green-gray infrastructure. This is the 5th consecutive year in which there were 10 or more weather and climate disaster events in the U.S. causing over $1 billion in damages. The need for coastal protection of both people and assets has never been higher. Green-gray infrastructure is a design philosophy that combines nature with the selective use of conventional engineering approaches to protect coastal communities and assets from climate change. By blending natural green conservation with built gray engineering techniques, communities can incorporate the benefits of both solutions in a more comprehensive, robust, and cost-effective way than implementing either solution alone. No regret strategy number 3, sustainable ocean use. Looking to the deep ocean, the U.S. has the largest economic exclusive zone in the world, with an ocean-dependent economy generating over $138 billion, mostly related to the fishing industry. Shifts in management of fisheries have the potential to ensure that that industry can adapt to climate change and produce an ocean that is more bountiful and profitable than it is today, thus securing securing a healthy source of protein in a world where climate change threatens food security. Another way to safeguard against climate change is to protect at least 30% of the ocean by 2030. This 30 by 30 frame offers a target that would protect food supplies, bolster climate resilience, and provide safe spaces for marine life to rebound. Protecting 30% of the ocean and coast also offers an economic value estimated in the billions of dollars. But what can be done? Conservation International wishes the committee to consider the following. The U.S. should expand and accelerate conservation and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems for climate mitigation, as well as refine its use of coastal wetlands within the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory. We encourage U.S. decision makers to include green-gray options in their coastal protection and budget plans. We recommend the committee promote effective fisheries and aquaculture management that provides adaptive capacity for communities in the industry and protects critical ocean biodiversity. And we recommend that the U.S. supports the creation and sustainable management of ocean conservation areas as a climate adaptation strategy, specifically related to aid going to large ocean states. While much of the required emissions reductions needed to keep us below 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise must come from decreasing use of fossil fuels, nature-based opportunities can also play a critical role in the transition to low-carbon future and a safe climate. The Earth, and specifically the ocean, can no longer be expected to take abuse and still provide for us in the same way. The planet, this pale blue dot, belongs to us and is ours to manage, and we can't retreat from that responsibility to manage it wisely. Thank you for the opportunity to engage with this committee, and I applaud the committee's recognition of the ocean as a climate change solution.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. Now on to Andy Karsner. Welcome, Mr. Karsner. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, esteemed members of the committee, thank you for the invitation and the honor to testify before you today. You've got a sample of why I'm so proud to be associated with TNC and Conservation International and Jen and her good work. I want to thank the committee for the seriousness of purpose of which it's taking its task. Many people say that a committee without jurisdiction may not amount to serious consequence, but I've had the opportunity to get to know you both with such privilege, and it's come to my attention that this is one of the few oases in Congress where people can galvanize serious thought and coalesce into serious solutions. So there are great prospects for collaboration, and where there isn't, there is an openness towards the virtuous competition of big ideas. So I want to thank you both, because amongst the biggest ideas that this committee can prioritize in its recommendations going forward is how to use natural resource solutions and natural capital as a source of galvanizing a national consensus and bringing new value and prosperity to our communities. As you've heard from the other witnesses, we are in an era where we can easily identify what the value of natural capital is and bring it to bear. They've told you what is available and to be accomplished. I'd like to talk for a moment about how that can be done. Before doing so, I'd also like to compliment your staffs. I've had the chance to get to know Ms. Cohen, Ms. Cassidy, Mr. Hall, Mr. Banks, not just now in the context of this committee, but over their many years of service, including a dozen years ago when I myself was in public service, not just managing the Federal Applied Science Laboratories and our national labs, but also as a climate negotiator and a principal architect of the Bali Roadmap, the precursor to Paris. At that time, it wasn't the most fun job description to be George W. Bush's representative abroad entering the UNFCCC after a 10-year hiatus post-Kyoto. But I would enter each meeting introducing myself as a child of the Apollo generation, and I would explain to them that despite their own skepticisms, we Americans had a sensibility that there was no goal beyond our reach, that nothing was too distant, that all possibility existed in planetary solutions. That is the type of optimism that we should have today, because we have more resources, more capacity, more innovation, and more possibility about addressing our climate conundrum, but we need to do it through the lens of climate math and not merely a tired debate on the validity of climate science. Climate math means understanding and identifying what volume of emissions reductions is available, from what source, and at what price. And I urge the committee to move the discussion strategically in that direction on Capitol Hill, so that we can get, with the spirit of this committee, we can proselytize that spirit and get into a competition of ideas about how to best achieve that climate math. Unequivocally, the best way to do it is to have nature solve for nature. There is no greater source of emissions reduction available. There is no man-made technology that can exceed nature's capacity to absorb, to drain, to sequester, and to minimize carbon emissions. And so the continuous dialogue about cutting off the spigot of emissions becomes less and less important going through time, relative to opening the drain and ensuring that we can return to a steady state ecosystem by allowing nature to perform its own functions without degradation, and valuing those functions into our marketplace. We've already launched a cascading series, chain reaction of unintended consequences. And science and technology both would dictate that we have to have an equal and opposite reaction that is symmetrical if we're going to problem solve at the scale and the magnitude and the time frame of the problem that we are addressing. I would like to believe that this can be done through natural capital resources, which cumulatively can address up to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. But it can only be done if it is brought into our market system and economy and valued appropriately. For that, we must have price discovery of the true value of nature, of all the benefits that the other witnesses have described here today. We have to be able to identify through information and analytics and insight those indicators that will inform innovation for financial instruments, insurance instruments, commodity supply chains, and ensure that we can continue to grow and prosper even as we remediate and make our communities more resilient. Madam Chair and Chairman Graves, thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering your questions, and I'm truly grateful for the leadership you bring to this issue.
Well, thanks to all the witnesses for your compelling testimony. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Okay, so to give Americans and the world the best chance of avoiding the worst consequences of the climate crisis, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found that global greenhouse gas emissions will need to drop by 45% by the year 2030 and reach net zero by the year 2050. Research shows that natural climate solutions can provide 1/3, I think Mr. Karsner, you just referenced that, can provide 1/3 of the emission reductions needed to meet these targets. So to all of the witnesses, I'll go down the row here, I would like you to prioritize what nature-based solutions you would highlight to us as we develop a national climate action plan, national climate policy to achieve net zero emissions.
Yep, thank you. Well, there are several. So, for example, reforestation is one of the largest opportunities. Planting trees has a very clear, consistent carbon benefit, and a lot of co-benefits. Also avoiding forest loss and grassland loss, land use through land use planning and reducing urban sprawl is important. And there are many opportunities in our agricultural sector that often are overlooked. So building soil health and improving nutrient efficiency, which have strong co-benefits for water quality. Wildfire risk reduction is something that has strong co-benefits that as we're dealing with forest fire on suppressed lands, and improve forest management through creating opportunities for private forest landowners to tap into the carbon markets and improve their forest management are all great opportunities that should be prioritized and included in a climate action plan.
Okay, Vice Chairman Myers?
Supporting forest sequestration, carbon sequestration, expanding the carbon program to include federal lands, and looking at including cultural, traditional, or prescribed burning on a landscape level to help protect our forests from catastrophic wildfire, while also renewing the growth of carbon through the current trees that we have in the ground, making sure that we fund those programs adequately and have a honest discussion as a nation about how cultural burning and traditional burning are viewed as a whole and move away from catastrophic fires that we've seen to devastate our forest.
Dr. Howard, you had a long list for us. Which ones would you highlight to us that would be the most impactful?
Can I share with Andy still? Thank you. So I think in terms of climate mitigation, I think one of the big strategies that not only the U.S. but the world needs to be considering is putting blue carbon ecosystems, their conservation and restoration, into their climate indices under the Paris Agreement. Many countries have already included these ecosystems, but the ambition can always be increased, including here in the U.S. And many countries, including increasing that ambition, can simply be including that ecosystem where it hasn't been before. Because they are so carbon rich, that can really improve their ambition just by simply including that one additional system in their land use sector. And then for adaptation, I would strongly recommend that we invest a lot more in this green-gray infrastructure design, because in that sense, you're also utilizing all the co-benefits of a natural ecosystem related to the fishing industry, food security, cultural practices, but then also increasing the floodplain, and doing that first, and then building great infrastructure on top of that to cover just what is needed, versus the reverse, which is building gray infrastructure first, and then the green comes in second, and usually that doesn't work as well.
Mr. Karsner.
Thank you. So I'll have just a little bit of a different twist, because I can't possibly compete with the expertise of identifying each ecological benefit. I'm as or more concerned with how to access those ecological benefits as to how to identify them. I don't think there's any shortage of solutions, whether it is blue carbon, whether it is coral reef abating storm surge, or mangroves sequestration, or forestry. We have no shortage of available solutions. We have a dearth of our capacity to access those solutions because presently we value nature in the wrong way. When we value a tree as wood, or wood only, or even in a virtuous way as forestry stewardship certified wood, we fail to value it for how it is respiring and sequestering carbon, or true cost account for it. So what I am proposing is greater transparency and disclosure in the way accounting is done for nature, so that more dollars flow in a more symmetrical way to natural capital solutions. My colleagues have identified what those solutions are. We can't possibly mine all those solutions in our lifetime, but we can spur the capital formation to direct ourselves in a symmetrical way to solutions in the way that we have created problems. And so I'm hopeful that the committee will take up and recommend that these natural capital solutions are eligible for sequestration credits under 45Q in the same way that a man-made sequestration research and development project is. If we have solutions available for wind and sun to offer tax credits, certainly we should for land and soil and storm abatement and things that protect our coastlines.
Thank you very much. Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, years ago, we worked with Nature Conservancy to help identify some of the priority areas in South Louisiana where we had coastal forests, the cypress and tupelo and other species that played important natural buffer roles for our sustainability. We were able to pioneer efforts to engineer oyster reefs in our coastal communities where we could design them in geometric formations where you could channel the wave energy up instead of into communities. The oyster reefs would create cleaner water. It would sequester carbon in the shells. It created habitat for many other species. Of course, the biomass from the oyster reefs themselves were beneficial. Win, 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 win. You had storm surge benefits. You had cleaner water benefits. You had the biomass and ecological productivity benefits. I mean, just again, win, win, win. And we would design those in strategic areas of our coast where we needed that type of performance. It worked really well. I think that here, as you've heard from our witnesses, we have other opportunities, plural, to build upon those types of successes. And as mentioned, I think bringing in our farmers, an extraordinary untapped resource in terms of natural resources management that can come into the fold and work with us to complement some of our efforts here. And I think also, as mentioned, some of our federal resources in terms of our national parks and wildlife refuges and BLM land and forest and other assets. Mr. Karshner, excuse me, you have probably more expertise than just about anyone in the States in terms of using capital formation and incentives to sort of complement or maximize the benefits of our natural systems. You, in response to the chair's question, you talked a little bit about tweaking incentives, but as you know, the United States spends an extraordinary amount of money today in research and development, basic energy, as well as clean energy technologies. You're king for the day. What do you do? How do you tweak those incentives to help to maximize our natural systems and the potential benefit there, or how the natural systems can complement some of our efforts to help to sequester and reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Thank you, sir. It will hurt some of my colleagues' feelings, being that I'm a former wind developer and have invested in solar and electric cars, and I'm still as enthusiastic in green technology as anybody you could possibly meet. But having managed that portfolio for the federal government, I saw the lines cross, and they're not going to reverse. The federal government is lagging and not leading in terms of the research that it is investing in energy technologies for the most part. That's not to say it doesn't have a vital and crucial role that shouldn't be fortified, but it needs to move on and move at the pace that the evolution of innovation is taking place in the markets. The real revolution that's happening that can most affect this domain, and particularly things like farmers and soil and the ecosystem we talk about, are not the things that are coming or leading in our national labs. They are data science, information technologies, sensors, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, the Internet of Things. That whole network, that whole capacity to make what has previously been invisible and unquantifiable become visible and quantifiable and migrate into our risk management decision making, migrate into our investment calculus, migrate into the way we think of the world around us, is a game-changing revolution. There's an example where we have robotics that can serve farmers right now that are picking berries in the fields of some of America's largest berry pickers. They're also taking soil carbon and moisture content samplings. They're gathering such an extreme amount of data that can be monetized to understand how sequestration works. I use that in the minute example because I know from your experience and the one you just characterized, we've known these things for years. We just haven't brought valuation to them. And we cannot tithe our way charitably nor tax our way through government to the amount of money that's necessary to invest in natural capital and nature solutions. We have got to tweak policy and incentives to shift that capital into that problem space.
Thank you. Madam Chair, let the record reflect the witness said he wants to give trees iPhones. No, thank you very much. I think you made an excellent point in that we have so much data out there, but we're not properly quantifying or evaluating it and comparing it to other expenditures and uses to determine how do you maximize the taxpayer funds that we have. I think it's an excellent point, and I think that it is largely an untapped resource. I see, before you, let me take this away for a minute. Very quickly, I'm gonna pretend like we're very close instead of butchering your last name, Dr. Joe. Could you quickly talk about the Lower Mississippi River afforestation project that y'all are working on and how that plays into this?
Sure. We identified the Lower Mississippi Valley as a great place for a reforestation project. The trees grow quickly. The land is relatively cheap, and there's ability to tap into carbon markets. And so those kind of targeted restoration efforts that also have co-benefits in terms of wildlife and improving water quality are the kind of thing that would be unlocked with if there was additional incentive to invest in natural climate solutions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony, for bringing your expertise. I want to start by following up on Dr. Howard's testimony. We know that every person on the planet benefits from a healthy ocean. It supplies oxygen that we breathe and regulates our climate. It's linked to the water we drink. It's home to a significant amount of life on the planet. It drives our economy. It feeds, employs, and transports us. And today, our ocean is threatened more than ever. Last month, you mentioned this, Dr. Howard, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. The findings are dire. The ocean is becoming more acidic, it's warming, it's losing oxygen as a direct result of human-caused emissions. So I'm glad we're discussing today the opportunity for the ocean to be part of the climate solution. I co-chair the House Oceans Caucus and the Congressional Estuary Caucus, and I'm working on legislation to strengthen, restore, and protect our wetlands to store blue carbon. My bill will create a national level mapping of blue carbon ecosystems and their sequestration potential, study the effects of climate change and other environmental stressors on the rates of carbon capture and storage, improve protections for existing blue carbon ecosystems, and restore and expand degraded wetlands. So Dr. Howard, in your testimony, you discuss how blue carbon ecosystems have, and I'll quote, soil carbon sequestration rates per hectare of up to 10 times larger than those of terrestrial ecosystems. So can you talk about what the scientific research gaps may be in our current understanding of blue carbon and its sequestration potential, and also discuss the role of wetlands as a climate adaptation tool for coastal communities?
Thank you very much, Chairwoman, for that question. So in relation to how do you use blue carbon ecosystems to increase our coastal climate mitigation strategy, especially regarding restoration, I think one of the things that we really try to highlight in the research that we do and the research gaps that remain is that these coastal ecosystems, just as you said, they store 10 times more carbon in the soil than terrestrial systems per area. And that's largely because of the salt water that is washing over them twice a day with the tide. That salt water inhibits microbial action, therefore you don't have degradation. And so when we're talking about research gaps, I think one of the big ones is that when you go to develop that area, and let's say you're draining it for agriculture or for hotel development or coastal development, when you start to develop that area and you drain that system, all of that microbial action kicks back in and you get all the degradation, then you get all of the emissions. However, how long that takes, how much of that soil is actually susceptible to that turning from a carbon sink into a carbon source still needs to be a little bit better defined. Right now, under the IPCC, we assume that the top meter of soil is actually at risk of all that carbon being released, and that's easily about 100 to 1,000 years of carbon accumulation that can be released within a decade. But we think that is incredibly conservative, and probably most likely much deeper soils as far down to 3-4 meters could actually be at risk depending on which actual conversion has happened. Was it agriculture? Was it development? Was it draining for something else?
Terrific.
So
And
that's
and I
one
don't want to
big
cut
area
you
of
off, but I really want to get another question in.
Sure.
So I really look forward to following up with you and working on this issue. But I have limited time, and I wanted to ask Vice Chairman Myers. I'm from Oregon, your neighbor to the north. In your testimony, you mentioned that to avoid disruptions and threats to Urich survival, natural resources were managed comprehensively for ecosystem-wide health, and you said that harvesting and gathering of resources were closely managed and in rhythm with natural cycles. So how does the Yurok Tribe define sustainable forest management? And in addition to prescribed burns, what other practices do you use to restore forests to their natural, healthy state? Can they be replicated or incentivized at the federal level?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think one of the obstacles that we face are jurisdictional issues. Managing a land on a holistic level, you have to see the landscape without jurisdictions and without the permitting issues that we've seen. The tool that we have found to be most effective to protect the forest is the use of cultural burning, but also making sure that we use proper logging techniques to create uneven age stands of forest that go back to more of a traditional forest landscape. And so I think much of what we discuss is not to preclude timber harvesting, but to use it as a management tool along with our traditional methods for land management, which include traditional fire at a landscape level. And I think that's what's important. Up to this point, fire on the landscape has been used for pilot projects, but I think expanding that has to be done on a landscape level. In California and Oregon, catastrophic wildfires are the fear that we live with on a daily basis, and the destruction to our families and our homes and our communities is second only to the fear of destroying our entire landscape as a whole.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here. This is certainly an important subject, and we appreciate you lending your expertise to it. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor and privilege of representing the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of pristine coastline, and I'm very proud of it. It's my home. It's where I've lived all my life and intend to live the rest of my life. And it's it's right at the tip of the spear, if you will, on what has been happening with climate change. In fact, we've had 3 hurricanes in the last 3 years and barely dodged one this year with Hurricane Dorian. And as a result of that, we've taken on a number of projects in trying to make our communities more resilient, because we feel like resiliency is extremely important. And I want to tell you very quickly about a couple of those. First of all, the University of Georgia, along with the Army Corps of Engineers and some private sector companies and nonprofits, have taken on an initiative called Engineering with Nature, where we use natural sediment in a way that makes beaches and wetlands and communities more resilient, and that's very important. Also in Jekyll Island, in Glenn County, the Army Corps of Engineers is working on a project that rearranges pluff mud in the intercoastal waterways to protect the marshes. And Tybee Island, which is one of our barrier islands in Chatham County on the coast, they've done a number of different initiatives. In fact, they are the first community in the state that has come up with a community-wide sea level plan, and also they are very involved in projects dealing with sand dunes, and that is certainly with dune restoration. I had the opportunity to visit and see some of this with them, and this is extremely important. I want to ask you, Dr. Ferrajoni, is that fair enough? Okay. These projects have been associated with federal funds, and I just wanted to ask you, how important is it to make sure that we at the federal government prioritize these projects and make sure that we're getting them done in a quick manner and in a way that we can make sure that these projects are done as soon as possible?
Certainly, there's a need for increased investment in those coastal ecosystems, protection and restoration. And they have this dual benefit, as you say, of storm surge protection, flood risk reduction. One of the other benefits they have is through storing carbon, and even further, some of our salt marshes, when they're disconnected from the ocean, they become freshened and they begin to emit methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And so simply reconnecting those saltwater marshes and making them salty again can reduce methane emissions and have a significant climate mitigation benefit. And that also restores their ecological function as an estuary by reconnecting them with the ocean. So that can be as simple as widening culverts and putting in
Right.
tide gauges.
Well, let me ask you this. You're familiar with the discussion about climate change and the conversation. Do you think that we're concentrating enough on resiliency, or do you think that we need to look more at how we can make our communities more resilient?
I think there's a great opportunity to increase the resilience of our communities, and it's this mix of gray and green infrastructure, if you will, but we've underinvested in that green infrastructure, and preventing development of places that are at risk, and maintaining that natural habitat as a buffer for storm surge is a great way to do that.
And you would agree that that we've got to have a buy-in by the private sector, that they've got to be part of this, and in order to have that buy-in by the private sector and to have their participation in this, we need a strong economy. So you would agree that a strong economy is important to this as well?
Certainly one of the potential sources for investment in natural climate solutions and protection is through voluntary carbon offsetting, and that's something that we're already seeing that in some industries like the airlines, where it's very hard to use anything other than to replace the jet fuel with renewables. They're planning to offset those emissions, and having that go to things that also increase resiliency is a win-win.
Good. I don't mean to be redundant, but I'm constantly reminding my colleagues up here on the dais that Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the nation, and that it is extremely important that timber, of course, and it helps us in removing carbon and how important that is. And just want to make sure that I get that plug in again, that the #1 forestry state in the nation is doing our part in trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And with that, I will yield back.
Madam Chair, I want to remind you from our last hearing that after the gentleman from Georgia left, we were able to track that down, and it was based on the number of trees per person with a funny accent in the United States.
All right. Any rebuttal? No. No, okay. Yeah. Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Karsner, I wanted to ask you a question. I was very interested in your testimony and about natural capital, and you talked about the valuation of natural capital. Where does a carbon tax fit into all of that, or does it?
Separate issue. It fits in at a macroeconomic scale of saying how do you create value for something. So taxation, of course, is the government's blunt force instrument to tip the scales and create value. When I think of natural capital, it is not a government-driven thing. It is a science-driven thing that says, what is the intrinsic valuation of the southern pine forest in Georgia, which breathes or respires at a different rate than redwoods in California. And that respiration should be valued for its carbon sequestration asset value, and somebody should pay for that service. It's an ecological service. So they're not at all mutually exclusive in the sense that both of them shift the way that we value and bring on the value of nature, but one I think is a top-down jurisdictional instrument, the taxation. The other is a bottom-up assessment of the true asset value of something we should be accounting for in the profit and loss of every decision that we make.
Thank you. I wanted to ask each and every one of you with just a yes or no answer. In order to get to the goal of a net zero emissions by 2050, do you think a carbon tax is an important component piece to getting there? I'll start with you and go down the line.
Yes.
Yes.
E.
We support our price on carbon, whether that is a tax or cap and trade, but yes.
Okay. Tax, fee, cap and trade, putting them all in the same category, roughly. Dr. Ferragamo, Farragani?
Dr. Joe?
I know. So I wanted to talk a little bit about urban forestation. So I noticed in your priorities you didn't mention that at all. You talked about forest management. So in terms of planting trees in our urban areas, is there a significance there in terms of moving the needle with regards to carbon
there's
emissions?
a surprising amount of opportunity. We estimate there's up to 8 million acres in our cities around the country that could have more tree cover that we could have. And it has surprising benefits. So even today, the existing tree cover, it helps prevent about 1,300 deaths from in heat waves. So largely from people that don't have access to air conditioning.
Sure. In my district, the city of Oxnard is got a grant from the state of California to plant a lot of fruit trees in an area that really in parts of the city of Oxnard is disproportionately affected by pollution. And so it's certainly a carbon emissions reduction tool, but also sort of a climate justice tool, all built into one. Are there other programs that California is doing to incentivize better forest management, urban forestation, that the federal government could be looking at?
I'm not familiar with California programs, but I can follow up with you on that. But certainly there's an opportunity to do more because when it comes to urban forests, it's not just about planting new trees, it's about protecting the trees we have because those urban trees are at risk of disease and stuff. So keeping those trees is important.
And one last question. So in my district, I represent the county, Ventura County in California, and we've had 2 of California's historically largest forest fires have taken place in my district over the last 16 months. So when we talk about better forest management and reforestation, and the balance, if you will, of resiliency and wildfire management. Help me. How do we balance those things through policy efforts?
I think we have the capacity to reforest in places that need it, and also to do wildfire risk reduction treatments in places that need it. They both require investment.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Palma, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Fargione, is that close? I mean,
It's for all of us.
Dr. Fargione. Yeah.
Fargione.
Fargione. I'll just call you Joe.
That works too.
All right. In your testimony, you highlighted a variety of ways that forests can be used to positively impact the climate, but could you discuss more detail the negative impacts of wildfires on the climate?
Sure. So when forests burn, that emits carbon, and so it's somewhat counterintuitive that one of the things that we recommend are cultural burning, which emits some carbon, but over the long term, what we're doing is restoring the balance. Places that have had fire suppression, they have lots of small diameter trees that serve as kindling. And so then when it does burn, it becomes very difficult to control, and you see some of the catastrophic wildfires that make the news.
But isn't it also true that one of the reasons that the fires burn so hot is that we fail to manage the forest properly, and there's enormous amounts of fuel on the forest floor?
Yes.
The other issue is that there are certain types of forests that fire is absolutely critical for continued growth, and the redwoods, longleaf pine in the southern states require management by fire. The other thing is that was stated, I think there's this assumption that it's the old growth forests that do the most for carbon sequestration, that there's no place for, in certain cases, for clear cutting. And the fact of the matter is there's a new study out of the University of Birmingham, I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I'll make sure everybody knows that. It's Birmingham, England, that the younger forests sequester more carbon. I think it's like 25% more. And I'm a forest owner, and I understand that you need to have forest at different stages of growth. So there is a place for forest management that includes clear cutting certain cases, definitely thinning to prevent catastrophic wildfires, but it's also increases the habitat for wildlife. And I see Mr. Myers, Vice Chairman Myers, nodding. You understand this. I just want you to comment on that because I think that needs to be part of our efforts to mitigate climate change. And the interesting thing about this study is that we typically think of the main bodies of forest that for carbon sequestration being the rainforest, the tropics, but it's really the more temperate areas. Eastern United States, parts of Canada and Russia, the boreal forest in Canada. You want to comment on that?
Sure. So there's a couple things in there. One is, forest products are a renewable resource, and so that's great where we can support those industries. So products that like cross-laminated timber or other forest products that are coming on the market that can be used in buildings can displace some other really carbon-intensive products. So we think that responsible, well-managed forests are something we need more of, and it's a renewable resource. In terms of the age of the tree, if you think about how fast the forest grows is one thing, but what we're talking about in terms of fighting climate change is taking more carbon out of the atmosphere and having it on the landscape, and that means having more older trees. So one of the things that actually, yes, having that younger tree growing fast, but also having longer rotations. If you go from having a 20-year rotation, the average age is 10 years, and you've got a certain amount of carbon. But if you have a 40-year rotation, the average age is 20 years, you've doubled the amount of carbon on the landscape. So yes, managed forests, yes, renewable resources, but also thinking about extending those rotation ages can help store more carbon on the landscape.
When you're talking about a younger forest, you're typically talking, though, about under 100 years, a forest that's not 100 years old. And when you're talking about forest products, even with pine, for like you mentioned laminated wood products, you're talking 20, 25 years before that forest would be harvested. Hardwoods is much longer. I do think that this should be a part of our discussion about mitigation for climate change, and part of our strategy should include planting more forest and having this scalable plan for forest reforestation and younger and older forest. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Huffman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Fargione, I was going to just say your name to show that we could do it, but my first question is actually for Vice Chairman Myers. I appreciated your testimony, Mr. Vice Chairman, about some of the tools that the Yurok Tribe is using to restore forest land and manage it for the values that you mentioned, including carbon sequestration. But one of the things you also mentioned was collaboration. And of course, in Northern California, we have a patchwork of land ownership and land uses. A lot of your good work has happened in areas where ownership is a mix of the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, private landowners that are your neighbors, and of course tribal land that belongs to you. Can you talk about how improved collaboration could help us scale up our carbon sequestration efforts when it comes to forest management?
Absolutely. The success that Yurok has seen and others around us has solely been through the partnerships that we have with the other agencies within our ancestral territory and our watershed. That is absolutely what drives it. Around the turn of the century, we've seen a breakup of our landscapes throughout the nation, moving to smaller parcels, both private and federal and state ownership. That makes land management extremely difficult to navigate. And the only way through that, no pun intended, thick forest, is to use partnerships and to have people working together, especially at the state and the federal level, with private industry and tribal organizations. I think through private foundations, we've been able to help fill the holes in the state and federal programs, and allowing there to be a nexus between all of those is really the path forward across the board.
All right, well, thank you. Mr. Fargione, I really do have a question for you. The last line of questioning was about reforestation, and I wanted to ask you to speak to what is the current rate of reforestation that you see, and how much more would we need to ramp that up to really put a dent in this problem?
Sure, there are, there's large reforestation potential, over 100 million acres that could be reforested. Right now, the amount of reforestation, I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but it's a drop in the bucket from what it could be. So, and that's on both. There's opportunities on private lands and also on some federal lands in places where many places that where there was fire or pests or drought that killed trees, and maybe some of those will come back naturally and some of them won't, and could be opportunities.
All right,
for
but it's not happening. We've got a lot
It's
of
not
untapped potential here, and we're not addressing it. Over to Ms. Howard, Dr. Howard. If we wanted to go really big on coastal wetland restoration and blue carbon, what would a program like that look like? Kind of similar to this challenge of we know reforestation would be good for us for our climate goals, but we're just not making it happen. What would we need to do? Do we need a no net loss policy? Do we need some hard targets that we to achieve? Do we need to set up mitigation banks? What are some of the things you'd like to, if we put you in charge of this and we wanted to go big?
Yes to everything that you just said. Thank you for answering my question for me. But in all seriousness, I think one thing to remember too is that mangroves, which are primarily found in Florida, but all over the world and provide a large mitigation service, are forests. So thinking about how do you include mangrove forests into all of the other forest regulation that we provide. But then I think it really gets down to this, where I would go big, is really integrating blue carbon ecosystems and green gray infrastructure. Those two things are complementary. They go together and can be done simultaneously. And it's going to be probably the best chance that we have to protect against climate change along our coast, where most of the global population will be living within the next 50 years or so. So expanding coastal conservation and restoration and combining that gray built infrastructure, which we traditionally do, but really expanding the green, because that's going to also have the climate mitigation benefit and the carbon mitigation benefit as well.
I'm going to try to sneak one more question into Mr. Karstner, if I can. You described the importance of better accounting for the carbon sequestration benefits of some of these natural systems. I can appreciate that, but at the same time, you seem to suggest that a carbon tax or carbon pricing wasn't necessary. How does capital move into these natural systems if you don't have some kind of a forcing mechanism like a carbon pricing system that forces offsets and investments in those things?
Sorry, sir, I may not have made myself clear. I certainly did not intend to give the impression that I did not think a carbon price was a beneficial thing. My point was that they're not mutually exclusive, they're separate and distinct, and that we're in an era of such tremendous change that we can't afford not to hedge. One pathway is dependent on a government action, the other pathway is dependent on market redesign. If I had my preference, I would execute on both pathways. Okay. So the idea of transparency and disclosure for precision and price discovery, so that the benefits of blue carbon or sequestered sequestration in mangroves being brought to evaluation is the surest way to move private capital. That does not alleviate the government of its responsibilities to appropriately price a negative attribute.
Appreciate that clarification. Thanks.
Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, who just left. Last week, this committee held a fascinating hearing on how we can better construct our buildings and infrastructure to be more resilient in the face of extreme weather events. During that hearing, I discussed how my home state of West Virginia suffered a major flood in 2016, which devastated many communities. Many of the solutions we have discussed in this committee, like carbon capture, building resiliency, and natural solutions, are all pieces of the same puzzle that fit together in the broader picture of caring for our environment and addressing climate change. To further build upon our discussion last week, West Virginia produces some of the best hardwoods in the world. In fact, we are number 2 in the country in hardwoods, but my friend left, so I can't rub that in. A big part of the economy in the state is focused on the hardwoods industry. Good forest management not only leads to a healthy ecosystem, but also to a healthy economy. Dr. Fargione, can you discuss how natural climate solutions can help build resilience, but extreme weather events such as floods?
Certainly. So if you think about our natural landscapes, when they're healthy, they act as a sponge. So when heavy rains come, they're able to absorb that. And that's obviously true in wetlands, and protecting and restoring those has a strong benefit there. It's underappreciated in agricultural lands, how building soil health increases the amount of the ability of the soil to hold water, which can have a flood reduction benefit. So those are all ways in which the landscape can help store floodwaters.
Would it be possible to add
Yes.
to that quickly?
Yes.
So when looking at coastal ecosystems, what happens upstream and upriver is also incredibly important. So as you maintain the forest and reforest along riverbanks, you're preventing some of the downstream impacts along the coast. So protecting forests upstream can also increase coastal protection along the coast.
I'm glad you brought that up, because particularly with our geography in West Virginia and going down to the Ohio River and the New River, that's where we go. Many of the practices you identified are targeted toward working lands such as farms, forest, and ranches. If landowners decide to implement these practices, can they expect any benefits beyond reducing carbon emissions?
Certainly. So there's benefits in forests and cropland and rangeland on all of those. So in cropland, building soil health and improved nutrient management. Building soil health increases the fertility and, as I mentioned, the water holding capacity of the soil, which is beneficial for yields and also in particular in drought years, because that acting as a sponge, it holds more water, making it more resilient during a drought. In rangeland, this is an area that requires more scientific research to demonstrate more consistently achieve these benefits, but there's some evidence that practices like rotational grazing can help increase the productivity and store more carbon in grazing lands. And in forests, there are practices like removing competing vegetation that actually help the forest grow faster, which is storing more carbon and making it more productive as timberland.
Thank you.
Representative Miller, may I comment on that?
Sure.
There are many ways, as was just described, that one could characterize as a qualitative benefit. I want to be perfectly clear about what is possible with natural capital. If you can quantify it, if you can measure it, then you can monetize it. Those farmers should be paid cash for soil sequestration of the carbon. That we should be creating prosperity and incentives that align with the societal objective that we seek. We can do that, but it's going to take breaking the tyranny of accounting where we value nature at zero. And so to actually assess the benefit beyond organic low-till farming, et cetera, and to actually say we should be paying for what we want to occur, we're going to need natural capital accounting standards.
Well, I was going to ask you to talk more about how we as policymakers can help encourage innovation in the natural solutions space. So I think you just answered my question before I asked it. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Neguse, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Natural solutions are an important piece of solving the climate crisis, and certainly that's been adduced through both the testimony from the witnesses today as well as the comments of my colleagues. And while I am sure we will explore agriculture in more depth in the future, I wanted to highlight the importance of considering agriculture partners when we are discussing climate solutions. In July, earlier this year, I introduced 2 bipartisan bills, the Study on Improving Lands, or SOIL Act, and the Sustainable Agriculture Research Act. And the goal of these bills is to support the efforts in carbon sequestration on agriculture and federal lands. And would be remiss if I didn't thank my colleague who is not here today, unfortunately, but Representative Armstrong, who joined me in Colorado recently on a tour of Boulder County and to visit with some of the farmers and farming communities in my district that are doing some pretty incredible regenerative agriculture practices. And to your point, sir, with respect to the exchange previously, are engaged fully with the local jurisdictions, so the city and the county officials, in a pretty robust program that essentially incentivizes farmers in our community to adopt some of these practices and to essentially take advantage of rotational practices in terms of helping grazing to sort of recover some of the soil in lands that have been depleted. So a number of really incredible synergies that are happening, I think, across the country, certainly including in my home state in Colorado and in my community, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity to talk about some of those today. I wanted to focus in on, and I apologize if this has already come up, I suspect it came up during your testimony, Mr. Fargione. I think that's okay. So, right, I'll check with, yeah, I'm just check with Representative Huffman before but that's the LWCF, and since it was enacted over half a century ago, the Land and Water Conservation Fund has helped conserve and safeguard thousands of acres of natural areas across the United States, including nearly 200 projects in Colorado's 2nd District alone that, as I mentioned, I have the honor of representing. The funding really is critical for protecting national parks, areas around rivers and lakes, national forests, national wildlife refuges from development, as well as providing grants to protect working forests and wildlife habitat, increase the use of easements, and fund state and local park and recreation projects. As I know you're no doubt aware, earlier this year, the Congress permanently reauthorized the LWCF, but failed to provide permanent funding for the program. There are a number of us who have been advocating to the appropriators, obviously in the House, but also our colleagues in the upper chamber to ensure that any omnibus funding bill that's compromise that is reached includes funding for the LWCF. And so I'm wondering if you could just describe the ways in which that funding can be an important tool to address the climate crisis, both with respect to mitigation and to resilience.
Yeah, thank you for that question and for your support of the appropriations for LWCF. As you have noted, it's the primary federal program for preserving lands and waters and has protected countless forests, parks, wetlands, and other public lands, and that sequester millions of tons of carbon. So maybe just one example, in the San Bernardino National Forest in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, that sequesters about 10 million metric tons of carbon a year in its forests, and or over 36 million metric tons of CO2. And that has received over 22 million in LWCF investments since it started and growing that. So these lands that are being protected by LWCF are a really crucial part of natural climate solution, and I hope we can get it permanently funded.
Well, thank you, and we're certainly going to keep working towards that end. And with that, I would just say again, thank you to Madam Chair for hosting this important hearing, and I'm very appreciative. I think that the focus on natural solutions, this is one of those areas in which there's a real potential for bipartisan solutions to emerge, and I think looking at this holistically and engaging stakeholders sort of across the spectrum. So I'm grateful for the chairwoman's leadership, and with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Caston, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much to all our witnesses. Mr. Karstner, I really, really appreciated your testimony. I think we tend to talk too often about government solutions, which are important, and I agree with you, it's critical, but our climate crisis is in the first instance a market failure. You only have to look at how many countries use so much less energy per dollar of GDP than we do to recognize that opportunity. And as I point out to my colleagues all the time, we are already making some progress towards fixing that in spite of our regulations, not because of them. Because at the end of the day, businesses like to make money, and if you have a zero marginal cost source of energy, it's kind of a money-making machine. It also happens to lower carbon if you do that right. But I think we'd all agree that a lot more can be done, and I liked your phrasing that you said we need to make the invisible relationships visible. And I want to hone in on one aspect of this, which is the disclosure that companies make as investors try to evaluate what they do. Now, I guess the first question is just if you'd agree that while there certainly are plenty of good actors in the space, would you agree that corporations and financial institutions in the United States and arguably globally are not yet doing enough to disclose the risks posed to their investors by the pending climate crisis?
Thank you, sir. I wouldn't agree with that as a uniform statement. I certainly think that is true and would apply to some, but I mean, I can think of outstanding leaders like Walmart, Google, Dow Chemical. There are many that are using international voluntary performance standards that are world-class, but there is not a compliance standard that ensures that uniformly we're doing it. So one could say we're lagging in general, but I wouldn't say universally that's true across the board.
Yeah, no, and thank you for the clarification, because that's why I said at the start, there are good actors. I sometimes think that Walmart's commitment to buy 100% clean energy would be something that we should follow, since I think Walmart's the #2 electricity consumer in the country, and the Department of Defense is #1. Maybe we could find some things we could copy there from the private sector. But let me just pick up on what you said, because this sort of universality of disclosures, would you agree at least that the current range of disclosure protocols is inconsistent, and therefore how public corporations disclose the risk has a pretty wide error band around it?
Yeah, absolutely true. And I think that the amount of undisclosed risk is sufficiently opaque that Congress should be significantly alarmed about how mispriced risk is affecting things in the marketplace today. Absent any policy guardrails, the market is moving on. It's discounting real estate prices. It's making insurance unaffordable for homeowners along the coast in the Carolinas and Florida. It's even making insurance inaccessible in some places. So the delta of mispriced risk that is occurring in the marketplace versus the government's assessment or compliance standards for it is a significant gap, and I would find it to be a worrisome gap.
Do you think there's a role for us to at least standardize the way in which those risks are disclosed?
Yeah, I personally think it's fundamental to the functioning of a marketplace to have transparency and disclosure, accountability and responsibility of all the actors, whether they're individuals, homeowners, small businesses, or corporations. That is what makes a market function well, with societal guardrails to an outcome that our representatives would prescribe. Right now, I think we're neglecting that objective, and I think Congress has an opportunity to say, this is the accountability we would want. What we're looking at is a classic economic tragedy of the commons. This is all ball. And the question is, what will the remedy of the commons be? And the remedy will be accountability through transparency and reporting that has people making risk management and investment decisions based on accounting for the value of nature.
Well, first off, when we're done here, I may hire you for my comms director. And don't get me wrong, my comms director is awesome. You can apply for the job, put it that way. It's going to be contentious. But this is precisely why I introduced H.R. 3623 with Representative Cartwright. Senator Warren is leading the Senate version of this. And, coming from the private sector, I am not aware that you can choose as a corporation any flavor you want of how to disclose your liabilities. GAAP says what the liabilities are. And while ESG reporting is terrific, there's a wild disparity in how companies report the liability that their investors face on climate change. And what the Climate Risk Disclosure Act would do, and it passed out of financial services earlier this month, by the way, would require public corporations to disclose information relating to their financial and business risks associated with climate change, and would require them to do that in a standard way. And, as I sit here and look at how investors make decisions, investors balance risk and return. But if the risk isn't disclosed in a consistent way, it's very hard to expect consistent returns. So thank you, and I encourage all of my colleagues to follow the good guidance of our excellent witness. I yield back.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank the witnesses and all of the members for engaging today on these important natural solutions. As we've heard, nature offers us so many solutions to the climate crisis, and I think we've identified common ground, pun intended, for our March committee recommendations. I want to remind everyone that we have a request for detailed policy proposals on our website, house.climatecrisis.gov. The deadline for those recommendations for the committee is November 22nd. But I also wanted to highlight a report that came out yesterday that Chairman Paul Tonko hosted the scientists over in the Rayburn. They were from Woods Hole Research Center, and their just released study said that the Arctic now in winter is releasing carbon dioxide, making it a source of carbon rather than a sink that we had all hoped would be maintained. But the Earth is warming. The Arctic carbon deep freeze is breaking. And that's one of the reasons that we've all got to work together to follow the science and develop bipartisan climate solutions to tackle the climate crisis. So thank you all for being here. I want to ask unanimous consent to include in the record the summary for decision makers of the report, The Ocean as a Solution to Climate Change. Dr. Jennifer Howard is one of the authors of this important report, and it was this high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy is a unique initiative of 14 serving heads of government, including Australia, Canada, Chile, and other countries. So without objection, this is entered into the record. Thank you all for being here today. The committee's adjourned.